Fear Effect, now that's a goddamn video game. Quite possibly my favourite thing ever to drop on the PS1, and there's some stiff competition there. This is just a unique game that sticks with me to this very day. Like, I always come back for a replay on this one. For me, this really is comfort food. It distills the essence of a time and a place. That time being 90s anime and action movies, and that place being video games, I guess. But nonetheless, comfort food. So let's get into what's going on here. I genuinely think everything about this game is really quite impressive even to this day. But let's start off with the story and see who we are and what we're doing. We got a team of 3 mercenaries here, Hannah, Glass and Deke. And we start off with them here on a helicopter going into futuristic Hong Kong to ransom the daughter of a triad lord back to him. Anyway, they arrive at this helipad and the contact isn't there, so straight away the deal's gone south. This spirals into a series of events that takes them all over different parts of China and through hell, non-metaphorically. I could really get into it about this story because I think the writing is of a very high quality, but also I wouldn't like to spoil it. I know it's a very old game, but if I happen to convince you to check it out, I'd like you to have some surprises. So let's have a look at what we do here. This is somewhere in between a survival horror game, a classic sort of adventure game, and an action game. We're working with tank controls, we've got item-based puzzles, and there's lots and lots of shooting. The game has a really nice pace to it, and you're constantly clicking between the 3 different characters and looking at their different parts of the story. The mission changes and updates as you go on, but they're always working as a team to try and do their bit. I don't think there's really any difference in gameplay styles between the characters other than they just have different weapons. It felt like I did more puzzles with Hannah, but I think that's just because you spend more time playing as Hannah. Still did a fair amount with Deke. And speaking of Hannah, Glass and Deke, big shout out to the voice acting crew here because they all did a banging job. I don't even mean that in the normal way I would say that about 90s and 2000s video games, where it's kinda hammy and cheesy but it's very endearing. The acting quality here is actually really good.
So, were you both in?
Getting hold of Wei Ming first may be the only way we get out of China alive.
Look, Glass, I signed on this gig for one reason, right? The money.
We'll still get it. But Wei Ming is our bargaining chip with Mr. Lamb and the Triad for our lives now. That means we find her first, find her fast, and drop anyone who tries to stop us.
Well, that's something then. Right, I'm in. I guess we'll need this.
So in the classic adventure game style, you're generally just trying to find how you get through different areas by solving puzzles. Usually they require key items or passcodes or switches or something like this. Some of the puzzles are fairly esoteric, and upon replaying it this time I found myself having to Google a few things, so I am wondering how I did it back in the day when I was a kid. But I did, many times. I used to replay this game all the time. There are also some opportunities for stealth in this game, sneaking around and hitting the guards in the back with a knife or a smackjack. But I would hesitate to call it a stealth game because most of the time you are going to be blasting. You're actually going to be blasting so much it's ridiculous in disc 4. Which is an interesting thing, this is a 4-disc game even though it's not particularly long. But I guess those looping backgrounds and the frequent FMVs in the game do take up a lot of memory. Now let's talk a little bit about those aesthetics because there's a really interesting mix of stuff going on here. Straight away you can see from the character design, the cell shading and the futuristic city that 90s anime like Ghost in the Shell and stuff like that was a pretty big influence here. Also 80s sci-fi stuff like Blade Runner and 80s horror movies like Zombie Flesh Eaters and Evil Dead, which will come up later. The game's got a real blend of genres going on and that's reflected in the aesthetics. The first part of the game is all pretty grounded and realistic. We've got a sci-fi futuristic vibe, but we're only fighting against triads and army dudes. So we're running about on nighttime rooftops with big neon signs, evading helicopters and all that kind of stuff. But then when we get into Disc 2 things change massively because we get zombies into the mix. There is a relatively good story reason why zombies just suddenly start turning up, but I don't want to spoil that for you because it's a little bit of a twist. But we wind up in this ramshackled fishing village out in the jungle. It's got this steamy human vibe to it that really does make me think of Italian horror films from the 80s. You start running into machete-wielding zombonis and these cool kind of demon ninja guys with the hook hands. All the enemy designs are quite visually interesting, I think. Disc 3 and especially Disc 4 takes a massive shift towards Chinese mythology. We take a trip through this traditional Chinese version of hell, where we meet a King Yama stand-in and some other famous characters like the Hebei Wu Chang. That's not me being clever, I googled who the black and white brother characters in this game were because I always found them really good and I like their voice actors.
Now go. We are preparing for a funeral.
But I think the art direction is the star of the show here really, and in a lot of ways the backgrounds. Pre-rendered backgrounds had become a staple of horror games around this time because of Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil, but what Fear Effect does is really unusual. All of the backgrounds are FMVs that loop, so it gives the impression of the world being in constant motion, whether it's sparks or searchlights or helicopters going past. It really makes the world feel lived and immersive. But because it is a pre-rendered image and not polygonal models, it does give it a very uncanny vibe. But I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean it's got its own feel to it. It's actually one of the reasons I'm kinda glad they decided not to remake this game. A little bit of a side note, but Fear Effect has kind of had a bit of a weird and rocky time as a franchise. I think everybody liked this one, and then Fear Effect 2 came out, and I think everybody liked that as well. They did plan to do a third game on the PS2 called Fear Effect Inferno, but it got cancelled allegedly due to quality reasons. Although there is a fair amount of information about it and even a prototype build, and it looks pretty good to me. Anyway, it came back in recent years as a tactical action game called Fear Effect Sedna, and then the plan was to remake the original. But they've now settled on remastering it, which I think is a better idea. My worry is that a remake would take away a lot of this charm. What we're seeing here on the PS1 version is born out of limitations, certainly. The team clearly wanted to make this big sweeping cinematic game where there's something happening on every screen, but because of the limitations of what you could do with polygons on the PS1, they had to do that with this clever looping FMV trick. But like I say, that looks awesome and gives it its charm and its vibe. I guess I'm just saying that if they remade this and took that element away, I really feel it would lose a lot, so I'm glad that they're remastering it instead. Another unique touch this game has, which helps to make it feel more cinematic, is that everything happens in camera. Along the bottom of your screen here, your inventory will pop up when you're scrolling through, and then you can choose your items in real time. Sometimes that does make combat feel a little bit clunky or fiddly when you're trying to reload or switch your weapons, but it does help to never break the immersion and always keep the flow going, so you do feel like you're in this very cool anime movie. I am a little bit biased because this is one of my favourite games of all time, so I would encourage anybody to check it out, and I don't have many criticisms to give. You could say the tank controls are a little bit dated, but I don't really care about that. The only thing I would say is that the difficulty spike is insane. I'd say Disc 1's pretty easy, Disc 2 probably hits the sweet spot of challenge, Disc 3 gets a little tricky, and then Disc 4 is absolutely ridiculous. I don't know if I've ever beaten Disc 4 without using some kind of cheat, full disclosure.
That wasn't very neighborly of you there, mate.
You have no idea what you are up against.
How you find this funny, then? How's this for a punchline?
I would say that Fear Effect is in the pantheon of games where there isn't anything else like it. There aren't many games I say that about. Blue Stinger's probably the only one I can think of off the top of my head, and that's another of my favourites. And for that reason alone, I really think you should check it out, and I hope I've done something to sell it to you here. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you did, please hit all the relevant buttons to let me know. Take it easy out there, my dudes, and I will see you in the next one.